Hello there. Tonight's story doesn't begin with battle cries or burning ships. It starts with something much smaller, much quieter. An apple, a golden one, tossed into a wedding and rolled straight into legend. We're drifting into a time when gods walked beside mortals, when kings were bound by oaths, and when a single choice could ignite 10 years of war. This isn't the Greece of marble temples and philosophers, not yet. This is the mythic age, older, stranger, and far more alive. Heroes cast long shadows, and the gods still meddled with every human step. If stories like this help you unwind, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you breathe a little slower. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Somehow there's comfort in knowing we're all drifting through these old tales together. So, settle in. Let the past unfold slowly, and let's begin with the moment that set the Trojan War in motion, not with swords or fire, but with a celebration. A wedding so grand it could only belong to the gods themselves. Imagine golden goblets, celestial music, and a feast no mortal could ever dream of attending. The setting lies somewhere between the heavens and the wine-dark sea, the marriage of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph of breathtaking beauty and unpredictable moods. One day she's calming the waves. The next, she's a lioness made of fire. Sea nymphs were like that, beautiful, untamable, and just a little bit dangerous. This was no ordinary wedding. Every major god was in attendance: Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, and of course Dionysus, who surely came for the wine and stayed for the drama. You see, there had been a prophecy that Thetis's child would one day surpass his father. None of the gods wanted to risk that happening, so they arranged for her to marry a mortal instead. Peleus was chosen, a brave man, respectable enough, and probably smart enough not to ask too many questions. But every great story has a shadow, and this one came in the form of a goddess who wasn't invited. Her name was Eris, the goddess of strife, discord, and general inconvenience. Think of her as the divine equivalent of a disastrous group chat. Furious at being left out, she decided to make her presence felt. Eris arrived uninvited and brought a gift, a golden apple, gleaming and perfect, inscribed with just 3 little words: "To the fairest." She tossed it into the banquet hall, smiled at the sudden silence, and walked away satisfied. The gods might have been divine, but they were far from above petty jealousy. 3 goddesses instantly claimed the apple: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each one believed herself the fairest, and none were inclined to back down. Faced with this divine standoff, Zeus wisely refused to pick a winner. Instead, he passed the problem on to a mortal. His name was Paris, Prince of Troy. He was young, handsome, and, as fate would prove, disastrously unqualified for diplomacy. At this time, Paris wasn't living as a prince. A prophecy had once declared that he would bring about the downfall of Troy, so his family had him abandoned as a baby. Yet he survived, raised as a shepherd on Mount Ida, blissfully unaware of his destiny. When the 3 goddesses appeared before him, it wasn't in humble disguise. They arrived in full divine splendor, each offering a bribe. Hera promised him power, the rule over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in every battle. But Aphrodite, ever perceptive, promised him something far more intoxicating: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, thinking more with his heart than his head, handed the golden apple to Aphrodite, and with that choice, the seeds of war were sown. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, or in some versions, Nemesis. She had once been courted by nearly every great king in Greece. To avoid bloodshed, her father, King Tyndareus, had made all her suitors swear an oath that no matter who she chose, they would defend her and her marriage. It was, in hindsight, a political powder keg waiting for a spark. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, capable, steady, perhaps a little dull. Peace lasted for a while, until Paris arrived at court. With Aphrodite's guidance, he either seduced or abducted Helen. The sources differ. In Homer's version, Helen seems weary and regretful. In others, she's more defiant. Some later poets even claimed the real Helen never went to Troy at all, that it was only a phantom version, while the real Helen waited out the war in Egypt. Whichever story you choose, the result was the same. Paris sailed back to Troy with Helen, and Menelaus called upon every king and warrior who had sworn that ancient oath. This is where myth begins to blur with history. Scholars have long wondered whether the Trojan War actually happened. Archaeologists have uncovered the ruins of a great city at Hisarlik, believed to be Troy, that was destroyed multiple times by fire and conflict. Trade routes crossed the region, wealth flowed through it, and battles surely followed. Perhaps no gods threw lightning from the heavens, but someone, somewhere, really did throw spears over those walls. And so the Greeks gathered their forces. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, took command, not because he was loved, but because he had the ships, the soldiers, and the authority. Kings and heroes from across Greece answered the call. Odysseus, clever and cunning, Nestor, wise and talkative, Ajax, strong and stoic, and Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, whose wedding had started this whole chain of events. Achilles was raised by the centaur Chiron and trained to be the greatest warrior of his time. His mother, fearing for his life, dipped him into the river Styx to make him invincible, all except for the heel she held him by. And that, as legend tells us, became his one weakness, his Achilles heel. Even the greatest heroes, it seems, have their vulnerable spots. Not all the heroes were eager to join the war. Odysseus pretended to be mad, plowing his fields with an ox and a donkey while sowing salt instead of seed. But his ruse was exposed when his infant son was placed in front of the plow. Odysseus swerved to avoid him, proving his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, too, tried to escape his destiny. His mother hid him among the daughters of a foreign king, disguised as a girl. But when Odysseus visited, he laid out gifts, jewelry and weapons alike. Achilles' hand went straight for the sword. Some disguises are simply not meant to last. At last the Greek fleet gathered, 1,000 ships, if the poets are to be believed. But the winds refused to blow. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended by Agamemnon, perhaps for boasting of his skill or for killing one of her sacred deer. To appease her anger, she demanded a terrible price, the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. And that is where tonight's story pauses, on the edge of windless seas, with war waiting just beyond the horizon. This is one of those moments in Greek myth where the story takes a sharp and somber turn, from grandeur and celebration to something heartbreakingly human. Agamemnon hesitated, as any father would, when faced with the demand to sacrifice his own daughter. But in the end, ambition outweighed love. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis with the promise of marrying Achilles, only to face her death instead. Some versions of the story try to soften the blow. They tell us that Artemis, moved by pity, swept Iphigenia away at the last moment and left a deer in her place. But most accounts are far less forgiving. Agamemnon made the sacrifice himself, and when his daughter's blood touched the earth, the winds finally began to blow. It was a grim start to what would become a grim war. And so, with divine grudges simmering, sacred oaths invoked, and personal tragedies piling up, the 1,000 ships of Greece set sail for Troy. None of those aboard could have imagined they would remain there for 10 long years, or that by the end, nearly all of them would be dead, disgraced, or lost to wandering. But that, dear listener, is a story for another night. For now, rest easy in the thought that even the greatest war in myth began not with a sword, but with a wedding, an insult, and a single golden apple. Now, let's turn our gaze from divine quarrels and goddesses to the woman at the heart of it all, the one who, as the poets say, launched 1,000 ships. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, but Helen of Sparta, later of Troy, was indeed the center of the storm. Her story begins, as so many myths do, before she was even born. Her mother, Leda, was queen of Sparta. One day, Zeus, ever watchful, ever insistent, saw her from the heavens and decided to pursue her. But instead of descending in his thunderous, godly form, he transformed himself into a swan. Yes, a swan. Because in myth, The gods' methods of courtship were rarely straightforward. From this strange union came an even stranger result, an egg, or in some versions, several. Myths are never shy about the miraculous, but seldom concerned with logic. From those eggs hatched Helen, along with her brothers Castor and Pollux, and her sister Clytemnestra, who would later play her own dark part in the tragedies of Greece. Helen grew up in royal luxury, destined from the beginning to draw eyes and stir hearts. Her beauty, they say, wasn't merely mortal beauty. It was something divine, the kind that made men sigh, made women whisper, and made kings do foolish things. When she came of age, Helen was courted by nearly every notable man in Greece, warriors, princes, and kings alike. Among her suitors were Odysseus, Ajax, and Menelaus. There were so many that her father, King Tyndareus, faced an impossible problem. No matter whom he chose, the others might start a war, so, on the advice of Odysseus, ever the tactician, Tyndareus proposed a clever solution. Each suitor would swear a solemn oath to accept Helen's choice and, more importantly, to defend her marriage if anyone ever tried to take her away. It became known as the Oath of Tyndareus, and it bound them all. A brilliant idea, though, as with most brilliant ideas in Greek myth. It would later backfire spectacularly. Helen chose Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and a man of wealth and solid reputation. Menelaus was capable and commanding, though perhaps not the most charming, the kind of man who kept his armor polished and his kingdom orderly. Helen and Menelaus married, had a daughter named Hermione, and for a time all was well in Sparta. And then Paris arrived. Paris, Prince of Troy, had not been raised as a prince at all. At his birth, a prophecy declared that he would one day bring about the destruction of Troy. To prevent that fate, his parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, left him to die in the wilderness. But Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a strikingly handsome young man, one with charm, but very little foresight. Eventually, he was welcomed back into the royal family, the prophecy conveniently forgotten. Not long after, he was sent to Greece on what was officially a diplomatic mission, though the gods had other plans. When Paris arrived in Sparta, Menelaus received him graciously, as hospitality demanded. In Greece, being a good host was sacred duty. Food, wine, and safety were offered freely. For a time, all was cordial. But then, Menelaus was called away to attend a funeral, leaving Paris alone in the palace, alone with Helen. And that was when Aphrodite's promise came to fruition. She had sworn Paris would have the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, and now she saw to it. Whether Helen went with him willingly or was swept away by divine manipulation is one of the great ambiguities of myth. Homer's Iliad portrays her as sorrowful and reflective, full of regret but not entirely unwilling. Later plays, like those of Euripides, give her either more agency or none at all. Some even suggest that Helen never went to Troy at all, that it was only a phantom image of her, while the real Helen remained hidden in Egypt. But in the version most often told, Helen sailed away with Paris, leaving behind her husband, her child, and her homeland. More importantly, she broke the oath of Tyndareus, and with that, unleashed a storm across all of Greece. When Menelaus returned and found her gone, he was not merely heartbroken. He was humiliated. His honor demanded vengeance. So he called upon every man who had once sworn to defend Helen's marriage. Messengers rode across Greece, summoning kings and heroes alike. Old alliances reignited, and the greatest warriors of the age prepared for war. Agamemnon assumed command of the expedition. Proud, ambitious, and ruthless, he was not loved, but he was obeyed. Odysseus, who had no desire to leave his wife and newborn son, tried to feign madness, plowing his fields with salt. But when the Greeks placed his infant son in front of the plow, Odysseus swerved to avoid him, proving his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, too, tried to escape his destiny. His mother Thetis, knowing he was fated to die if he went to Troy, hid him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the king's daughters. But Odysseus once again saw through the ruse. He laid out trinkets and jewels, and among them a sword. Achilles reached for the weapon, and his fate was sealed as well. At last, the greatest army Greece had ever known gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships strong, if the legends are to be believed. But before they could sail, They sought a sign from the gods. The Greeks believed in omens, and the gods were thought to speak through the world around them. At Aulis, a serpent appeared and devoured 9 sparrows before turning to stone. The seer Calchas declared it a prophecy. The war would last 9 years and Troy would fall in the 10th. One imagines that morale dropped a little at that. But still, they pressed on. The fleet launched at last, driven by pride, prophecy, and vengeance. Yet their first target wasn't Troy at all. It was a nearby city called Teuthrania, which, as it happened, looked a bit too much like Troy for comfort. Even legends, it seems, have their wrong turns. Geography, as it turned out, was not the Greeks' strong suit. But eventually they reached Troy and built their camp along the shore beneath the city's mighty walls. According to the old tales, those walls had been raised by Apollo and Poseidon in disguise when they were briefly bound to serve King Laomedon. Which is to say, they were sturdy. This would not be a quick war. Inside the city, Helen was not received as a prisoner, but as a queen. Priam, the aging king, treated her with grave courtesy. Hector, his son and Troy's greatest defender, was polite, if unmistakably disapproving. For all its splendor, the city had become a gilded cage. Helen was now the face of a conflict she could neither halt nor escape, praised and blamed in equal measure, seen by all yet truly known by none. The war outside settled into a long, grinding stalemate. Raids at night, skirmishes at dawn, embassies sent with careful words and quicker tempers. Heroes rose and heroes fell. Through it all, Helen remained at the center, not fighting but watching, her presence a paradox. She is remembered less for deeds than for the gravity she exerted, the way men bled and boasted and perished for a prize that was also a person. And what of Helen herself? The myths refuse a simple answer. Some say she loved Paris, then loathed him. Some say she pitied Menelaus, then despised him. In one telling, when Troy falls, she returns to Sparta and is forgiven. In another, Menelaus's mother strangles her in righteous fury. The poets could never quite decide. She was too beautiful to be purely wicked, too dangerous to be purely good. Perhaps the war itself made flesh, not rational, not fair, and somehow inescapably inevitable. So with Helen in Troy, Menelaus ablaze with fury, and every king in Greece sworn to vengeance, the stage was set. The siege had not yet truly begun, but the fuse was lit. The walls of Troy still loomed unbroken, yet every god, every mortal, and every poet understood they would not stand forever. In our next chapter, we'll meet the full cast of heroes and begin the siege proper, a contest of pride, prophecy, and tragedy that would shape not only story, but the soul of the ancient Greek world. For now, rest, dear listener. The storm is gathering, but there is still a moment of quiet before the swords begin to sing. It is a strange thing, preparing for a war that has not yet begun. The blades are still sheathed, the ship's not yet underway, and yet the quiet decisions made in these hours, the stubborn ones, the oath-bound ones, echo as loudly as any battle cry to come. And so we return to Greece, where alliances are being called in, oaths remembered with theatrical seriousness, and kings step out from the shadows of their own ambition. The Greeks, more properly the Achaeans, were not a single nation but a loose collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own king, customs, dialect, and towering pride. Herding them was like herding cats. Large, armored, exceptionally opinionated cats. Somehow Agamemnon took on the task. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was not beloved. He had the charisma of wet marble and the diplomatic touch of a battering ram. But he had ships, and in the Bronze Age that counted for everything. He was also the brother of Menelaus, whose wife had either absconded with or been abducted by a Trojan prince, depending on who told the tale. In any case, duty and the chance to enlarge his power pushed Agamemnon to the front. But before we sail, let's meet the figures whose names have echoed down the centuries. There was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, cunning, sardonic, and a touch too clever for everyone's comfort. He would have preferred to farm his rocky island in peace. When the summons came, he tried to dodge it by pretending to be mad, yoking an ox and a donkey together and plowing with salt. The Greeks, unfortunately for him, had brought Palamedes, a man cleverer still. Palamedes placed the infant Telemachus before the plow. Odysseus swerved, sanity laid bare, and off to war he went, fuming. Then came Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis. the sea nymph with a gift for dramatic exits. Raised by the wise centaur Chiron, he learned medicine, music, hunting, and most of all the art of killing with grace. Thetis had received a bitter prophecy. Her son would either live a long, quiet life and be forgotten, or die young in glory and be remembered forever. Preferring obscurity to doom, she hid Achilles on Skyros, disguised among the daughters of King Lycomedes. History, however, does not forget Achilles. Odysseus was sent to retrieve him. Knowing no true warrior can ignore the call of bronze, he spread out gifts for the girls: fine robes, glittering trinkets, and one gleaming sword. Achilles reached for the weapon. A trumpet sounded, the disguise collapsed, and the hero stepped forward to claim honor, plunder, and undying fame. He brought with him his dearest companion, Patroclus, whose presence would become as vital to the war as any shield. Others joined the muster. Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, towering, blunt, strong as a bull, and roughly as eloquent. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, fierce in battle and unexpectedly reverent toward the gods. Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, who spoke in long, winding recollections of a golden yesterday and somehow made everyone listen. And Calchas, the seer who read the will of the gods in the ark of birds, the entrails of sacrifices, and, one suspects, the practiced art of a shrewd guess. They gathered men, ships and stores at the windswept harbor of Aulis, on the eastern coast of Boeotia. There the Greek fleet assembled, 1,000 ships, Homer says. A beautiful, improbable number. Myth cares more for cadence than logistics, and then nothing. The ships were ready, the men restless, and the gods silent. No wind stirred the sails. The sea lay flat as a philosopher's expression, a calm so total it felt like punishment. And indeed, that calm sea was a punishment. Agamemnon had made a grave mistake. While out hunting, he killed a sacred stag, an animal beloved by Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of maidens. As if that weren't enough, he boasted that he was the better hunter. In mythic terms, that was the equivalent of poking a sleeping bear with a borrowed spear. Artemis took the slight personally and refused to let the winds blow. The fleet would stay trapped at Aulis until Agamemnon made amends, and by amends, she meant the sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia. It went over about as well as you'd imagine. Agamemnon hesitated. He wept, argued, appealed to the gods. But in the end, for the sake of the war, for honor, vengeance, and all the usual noble-sounding reasons, he agreed. He sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, that their daughter was to marry Achilles, a lie and a fatal one. Iphigenia arrived, perhaps excited, perhaps shy, and was led to the altar. Some say she was killed. Others say Artemis, moved by mercy, whisked her away at the last instant and left a deer in her place. Either way, the deed was done. The winds returned, sails bellied with air, and the Greek fleet finally cut across the Aegean. Their first stop, however, was not Troy. In one of those inconvenient footnotes history tends to skim, they mistakenly landed at Teuthrania in Mysia, thinking it was Troy. Ancient navigation was more art than science. They attacked, and the local ruler, Telephus, was wounded by Achilles. Later, in a neat twist, Telephus was healed by Achilles with the very spear that pierced him. The Greeks could be both destructive and useful, sometimes in the same breath. At last, the fleet reached the western coast of what is now Turkey. The Trojans watched from their walls as the horizon blackened with sails, and they prepared. It's worth pausing to consider what Troy might have been. The site known today as Hisarlik reveals layer upon layer of cities built and destroyed over centuries. Among them, the levels archaeologists call Troy 6 or 7 show traces of fire, war, and sudden ruin, massive fortifications, great storage jars, and signs of trade with the Mycenaean world. Whether this was Homer's Troy, we cannot say for certain, but the echoes are there. The Trojans had their heroes. Priam, the old king, wise, weary, and still dignified, ruled from the citadel. Hecuba, his queen, kept a formidable court. Their sons were many, but none more famous than Hector, Troy's great defender, a prince, a husband, a father, and a warrior who fought not for fame but for duty. At his side stood Aeneas, noble and steady, said to be the son of Aphrodite, a lineage that, as Virgil would later claim, would lead to the founding of Rome. And then there was Paris, whose stolen bride, Helen, was now within the palace, guest to some, prisoner to others. Her presence brought both pride and tension. Some called her queen. Others saw in her the seat of disaster. As the Greek ships grounded on the shore and the beach bristled with stakes, both sides readied themselves for a long struggle, longer than any of them knew. It would last 10 years, claim the lives of almost every hero present, and reshape the landscape of myth forever. For this is how war begins in the ancient world, not with a single trumpet blast, but with whispers, broken oaths, divine grudges, and the slow gathering of storm clouds. The Greeks had assembled. The winds had turned. The gods were watching. And somewhere beyond sight, Fate, the tireless weaver, had already set her shuttle in motion. By now, the 1,000 ships had crossed the wine-dark sea and anchored off a city destined to become legend, Troy, called Ilion by the Greeks. It stood proud on the edge of the Hellespont, a glittering crossroads of east and west. To modern ears, Troy can sound like a place of poetry alone, gods, grand speeches, overlong battles, but beneath the story lies a real city. At Hisarlik, a walled stronghold rose and fell more than once, its ruins layered like a tragic novel. Here a stratum of ash, there arrowheads, and elsewhere clay tablets hinting at trade, diplomacy, and war. This is the place where myth meets memory. The Greeks came ashore and set up a camp not meant for a quick skirmish, but for a siege. Think less glorious charge and more sprawling tent city with strongly held opinions. They dragged their ships onto the sand, built a palisade, and dug a trench. They marked off zones for sleeping, for cooking, and, optimistically, for celebrating victory. Achilles and his Myrmidons took the southern flank. Ajax and the men of Salamis guarded the north. Odysseus, predictably, devised a clever supply route. They were not united in temperament, but for now they were united in purpose. Troy did not panic. The city's enormous walls, said to have been built by Apollo and Poseidon when they served King Laomedon, were so strong and so high that no mortal force could easily breach them. Within those walls lived the Trojans, who were not the villains later Greek bards sometimes painted them to be. Priam still ruled with composure. Hecuba saw clearly what many missed, and the jewel of Troy's defense was Hector, firstborn son of Priam and Hecuba. No demigod, no half-immortal force of nature. Simply a man of iron loyalty and measured strength who fought for city, family, and a little boy named Astyanax, toddling through palace halls while history quietly etched its plans. Paris, the younger son, was handsome, charming, and largely unprepared for the consequences of his choices. In Homer's telling, he is neither cruel nor brave, just painfully aware he's not built for the brutal stage he helped set. Helen lived in the upper chambers of the palace. Opinions differed. Some admired her grace and near-supernatural beauty. Others, more practical and less bewitched, blamed her for the war. One imagines she heard the whispers. In the Iliad, she is self-aware and self-lacerating. "Would that I had died before I followed your son here," she says to Priam. And yet she remains. The war did not begin with toppled towers. It began with raids. Unable to breach the walls, the Greeks struck Troy's allies along the coast, seizing supplies, enslaving women, burning what they could not carry. Campaign, retreat, rest. That rhythm defined the first 9 years. In one such raid, 2 women were taken whose names would become kindling for a greater blaze. Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo, was awarded to Agamemnon. Briseis was given to Achilles. They were not trophies so much as grimly claimed captives, concubines in all but name, and the gods were watching. When Chryseis's father begged for her return and Agamemnon refused, Apollo, god of plague, archery, and uncomfortable justice, sent pestilence through the Greek camp. Soldiers died, animals perished, the air turned foul. Agamemnon eventually relented, returning Chryseis to her father, but not without a flourish of arrogance. He demanded Briseis from Achilles as compensation. It was a disastrous choice. Achilles, already simmering with pride, withdrew from the war. He would not fight. He would not speak to Agamemnon. He would scarcely look at him, unless glowering counts. In the heroic code, honor mattered more than armor. Public shaming shattered the soul. Greek morale sagged. Without Achilles, their line thinned. Hector, meanwhile, surged forward, rallied the Trojans, and drove the Greeks back toward their ships. Chariots thundered, shields splintered, skirmishes flared, and still the walls held. Step back and the picture shifts from poetry to Bronze Age reality. Not trench warfare nor massed ranks in uniform, but chariots, short swords, and hurled spears, bronze, not iron. Armor was heavy and personal. Battles were smaller and often fought as duels between champions under the gaze of spectators. Think rugby with far more stabbing. Varvas also ritual. Before fighting, warriors boasted of lineage and favor from the gods. Afterward, they stripped the dead of armor, spoils both symbolic and practical. Yet beneath the pageantry lay real grief. Towns erased, sons never returned, women enslaved. The songs remember the heroes. The silence belongs to the nameless dead. The Iliad covers only a few weeks in the 10th year, yet in that narrow window the whole cast steps into focus. Ajax the Greater, a moving wall with a shield. Diomedes, fierce enough to wound even Ares. Nestor, the elder statesman whose counsel ran longer than some battles. And the gods, never neutral. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon favored the Greeks. Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares sided with Troy. Zeus, officially impartial, tried to keep order and failed spectacularly. They bickered, schemed, disguised themselves, and meddled like celestial micromanagers. On the ground, the war slogged on. Desperate without Achilles, the Greeks tried diplomacy. An embassy, Odysseus, Phoenix, and Ajax, came to Achilles with treasure, apologies, even the promise to return Briseis. Achilles refused, not out of petulance but principle. His honor had been trampled, and in his world honor was life. Even so, he could not ignore what followed. Hector led a sweeping offensive, driving the Greeks back to their ships. Fires licked at the hulls. For a moment it seemed Troy might win, not through trickery or sheer strength, but relentless pressure. This was the hinge of the war. The greatest heroes stood fully revealed, not yet clashing in their final forms, but poised on the brink. The Greeks dug in. The Trojans pressed forward. Helen watched from the walls, her fate and everyone else's still unwritten. The siege had begun. The walls stood tall, but something subtler was crumbling. Trust, pride, the thin threads binding king to king. And so the 10th year dawned with Achilles silent, Agamemnon chastened, and Hector rising. In our next chapter, the cracks will widen. What has simmered will start to boil. For now, rest easy. The ships still lie at anchor, the fires still smolder, and the gods, for the moment, have not yet drawn their final lots. People imagine the Trojan War as continuous roar, swords flashing, heroes shouting, gods hurling thunder. The truth, if myth allows such a thing, is slower and harsher. 9 long years of attrition, raids, hunger, sickness, and the occasional divine tantrum. Perhaps that is why the story endures, not only for the final blaze of horse and fire, but because it mirrors something human, a grand idea that, once set in motion, no one can quite stop. A war born of honor that slowly becomes anything but. Back on the beach, the camp sprawled like a market left too long in the sun. Ships drawn up, trenches dug, palisades driven deep. They had prepared for a short war and got a long one instead. Troy's walls held. The Trojans rarely risked open ground. Every assault ended in blood and frustration. So the Greeks turned outward, raiding, sacking allied towns, seizing food, livestock, gold, and most tragically, women. The war, for all its heroic verses, was brutally transactional. That is how Briseis and Chryseis enter the tale. 2 women pulled into the current, handed to men as rewards, and ultimately used to spark the quarrel that sundered the Greek coalition. The fracture ran deeper than a single dispute. Beneath polished speeches and bronze breastplates, the alliance frayed. Agamemnon's leadership, effective enough in arms, rankled in spirit. He had a habit of taking more than his share of spoils and offering less than his share of credit. Kings like Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax found themselves balancing obedience with ambition and growing irritation. Achilles withdrew entirely, pride scorched, honor affronted, and along the beaches, under a sky full of watchful gods, the 10th year of the war finally began to turn. He refused to fight. For long stretches he stayed in his tent, sharpening weapons, practicing the lyre, and radiating that brooding, Bronze Age intensity that made lesser men keep their distance. Meanwhile, the Trojans were far from idle. While the Greeks burned the countryside, Troy gathered allies. Reinforcements came from neighboring lands, Lycians, Phrygians, and others whose names time has blurred. Among them rode Sarpedon, a son of Zeus, who fought with a quiet dignity that would one day earn the respect of his enemies as much as his friends. Inside the city, tension simmered. Food grew scarce. Greek patrols cut off supply lines from the interior. Yet still the walls held, a stubborn symbol of endurance against impossible odds. As the war dragged on, both sides leaned harder on the favor of their gods, or at least the theater of it. The Greeks sacrificed to Athena, Hera, and Poseidon. The Trojans looked to Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis. The gods, for their part, behaved like magnified mortals, bickering, sulking, playing favorites, and sometimes striding onto the battlefield in disguise just to meddle. There is a story later poets tell in hushed tones. A duel proposed early on between Menelaus and Paris settled the matter man to man. Spare the armies. The duel was arranged. Menelaus, burning with the sort of fury that comes from public humiliation, fought like a storm. Paris, more fashionable than formidable, faltered quickly. As Menelaus moved in for the finishing blow, Aphrodite intervened, snatching Paris from the dust and depositing him safely in his chamber with Helen, who by then had grown very tired of this particular brand of divine interference. Aphrodite asked nobody's leave. Like an indulgent parent shielding a favorite child, she simply decided the lesson was over. Menelaus stood on the field, sword raised, wondering what exactly had just happened. Honor would not decide this war. Not cleanly. There were bright moments, to be sure. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, fought with such relentless precision that even the gods took notice. With Athena at his side, and for a time the power to perceive divinities among mortals, he wounded Aphrodite herself. A mortal blade nicked a goddess. Embarrassed and bleeding, she fled to Olympus, where Zeus, in a tone somewhere between gentle and exasperated, reminded her that war is a poor arena for those whose chief weapon is a love charm. Later, Diomedes even wounded Ares. The war god did what many warriors secretly dread. He complained to his father. Zeus was unimpressed and sent him back to the fray. These episodes, amusing as they are, reveal something deeper. The conflict had stretched so far that the line between divine and mortal had begun to blur. The gods were not distant. They were in the thick of it, scheming, sulking, even bleeding. And yet, despite the burning towns and fallen champions, the war refused to end. Like a bad guest, it lingered long past the hour it should have left. Back in the Greek camp, Achilles remained absent from the field, and the cost mounted. Without him, morale sagged. Hector pressed the advantage with bolder and bolder attacks. Losses climbed. Even Odysseus, who could usually braid courage out of clever words and watered wine, struggled to keep the ranks steady. In this thinning air of exhaustion and distrust, betrayal found room to breathe. You might remember Palamedes, the man clever enough to unmask Odysseus's feigned madness at the war's beginning. Odysseus did not forget. According to later tales, he framed Palamedes as a traitor, forging a letter and planting gold to suggest Trojan bribes. The Greeks, perhaps eager for a scapegoat, executed him without ceremony. One of their keenest minds gone. The price of the war was counted not only in bodies but in trust. Not only in cities but in virtue. The longer it went, the more it demanded, of reputations, of loyalties, of humanity itself. The coalition frayed. Agamemnon's arrogance grated. Achilles' silence grew heavier by the day. Even Nestor's rolling sermons, once taken as wisdom, began to sound like wind over stones. And Helen? She still looked down from the walls. Her beauty, undiminished, had become a symbol, a living banner. To the Greeks, she was what had been stolen. To the Trojans, what they refused to surrender. For Helen herself, she was trapped between myth and memory, between love and loathing. In the Iliad, she calls herself a dog, speaks of her own shame, wonders if she is cursed. Perhaps more than anyone, she understood what the war truly was. Not glory, but a slow unspooling tragedy. So the 9th year rattled to a close. The Greeks, exhausted and divided, still held the beach. The Trojans, battered and isolated, still held the city. The gods, nursing both wounds and wounded pride, still interfered at will. And Achilles, he still sat in his tent, silent, furious, yielding to no one. Not Agamemnon, not the war, not even fate. But something had begun to shift. In the Greek camp, a young man named Patroclus watched the night fires gutter and flare. Soon, very soon, that small, steady flame would spread. If war has a heartbeat, it isn't the clash of bronze or the thunder of wheels. It's the breath held between action and consequence. The hush before something terrible happens. This is where we reach the heart of the Iliad, not the war's beginning or its end, but a handful of days in the 10th year, when one man's wounded pride alters everything. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, grew up knowing he was marked by fate. Two paths lay before him, a long, quiet life that would be forgotten, or a brief blaze that would echo through the ages. He chose the echo. No one tells you that while you are living it, glory is rarely glorious. It is lonely, infuriating, and full of people who do not understand you. At the start of this chapter, Achilles is not fighting. His quarrel with Agamemnon over the captive Briseis has pushed him into a withdrawal so famous it fills the first book of Homer's poem. To call it sulking misses the point. Achilles was publicly humiliated. In a world where honor equals life, Agamemnon took both. Forced to return Chryseis to her father to stop Apollo's plague, Agamemnon compensated himself by taking Briseis from Achilles, as if trading women were a sensible method of morale management. By doing so, he violated the code every warrior lived by. A man's prize, however grimly won, was bound up with his dignity. Agamemnon might as well have ripped Achilles' shield from his arm and spat on it. Achilles did not answer with violence, which was surprising. He answered with absence. He folded his fury inward, shut his tent, and would not fight. Outside, the war began to tilt. Hector led charge after charge. Poor leadership and divine interference conspired against the Greeks. Lines buckled. Even great Ajax found himself forced to give ground. At last, the Trojans reached the ships, the very beachhead the Achaeans had held for nearly a decade. And there, with the hulls catching firelight and the wind stinking of smoke, the story poised itself on the knife edge where everything begins to change. Achilles watched and did nothing. It's one of the most striking turns in the Iliad. The greatest hero's defining act is, for a long while, refusal. He sits and stews, not for lack of courage, but because he will not give Agamemnon the satisfaction of calling him back. It's a study in how dangerous pride becomes when it hardens into principle, and how quickly the gods can unspool even the best of men. Meanwhile, Agamemnon, rarely so self-aware, began to panic. Only now did he grasp the cost of alienating his finest warrior. He offered ransom and riches, treasure, horses, cities, even the return of Briseis, untouched, as if Achilles should be grateful. He swore oaths, a rarity unless he was admiring himself. To deliver this apology, the Greeks chose their strongest voices: Odysseus with his silver tongue, Ajax with his blunt strength, and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor. Hoping that familiar love might succeed where politics failed, they entered Achilles' tent and found him plucking softly at a lyre, not sharpening spears but playing music. A quiet reminder that even warriors carry inner worlds. They pled their case: glory, honor, the needs of Greece. Achilles answered with calm conviction. He spoke of insult and futility, of how no heap of gold could purchase back a trampled dignity. He questioned the heroic code itself. Why should he die for a king who scorns him? What is victory if winning requires you to lose yourself? Achilles refused, and the embassy returned empty-handed. Outside, the war grew bloodier. With the Greek camp nearly aflame and the Trojans pressing hard, Patroclus stepped forward, friend, companion, brother in arms. Some say more than that. In Homer's world, the exact label matters less than the weight of the bond. Patroclus was Achilles' heart outside his body, and he could no longer watch the Achaeans fall. "Let me go in your place," he begged. "Let me wear your armor. Let them believe you've returned." "They'll break and run," Achilles agreed. "But set a boundary. Drive them from the ships. Do not chase them to the gates." Patroclus donned the god-forged armor, unmistakably Achilles, and led the Myrmidons to the fight. The ruse worked. The Trojans wavered, thinking the storm had returned. Patroclus fought brilliantly and recklessly. He struck down warriors in a sweep of fury, even Sarpedon, son of Zeus, a loss so great the gods themselves debated whether to intervene. Swept up in triumph, Patroclus forgot the warning. He pressed the Trojans all the way to the city walls. There Hector met him. They clashed, spear against blade, prince against champion, and Hector brought him down, not knowing who he'd killed until the helmet came away. Patroclus's death stunned both camps and the gods above. No one felt it like Achilles. When the news reached him, he collapsed. He wept, tore at his hair, covered himself in ash. His pride, his refusal, his rage, all of it bent inward, then flared outward. The wrath of Achilles had begun. It would be terrible. It would be magnificent. It would not be stopped. First he needed armor. Thetis, his mother, rose from the sea and went to Hephaestus, smith of the gods. The divine forge gave him new panoply. Bronze so finely worked it seemed to glow, and a shield vast enough to hold a world. Cities in peace and war, harvests and dances, constellations wheeling above. It was more than protection. It was fate made visible. Then Achilles returned to the field. The Greeks roared. The Trojans trembled. The gods watched, some in awe, others in dread, for when Achilles raged, he was not a man. He was a storm. He drove through Trojan ranks like fire through straw, fighting not for Agamemnon's pride or his own renown, but for grief. He battled the river god Scamander, who rose against him in anger at the bodies damming his waters, and only the intervention of Hera, Athena, and Hephaestus's flames pulled Achilles from the flood. At last he stood before Hector. That duel deserves its own breath, and we will return to it. For now, come back to the tent where Achilles once brooded. There he paced in fury, hands itching for retribution, heart burning with sorrow. His rage was not just about war. It was the weight of loss, the helplessness of watching the person he loved most in the world die. And knowing his own stubbornness helped set the stage. Achilles had rejoined the war, but it no longer felt like a campaign. It felt like a funeral in motion. There are moments when the clatter of war falls away and only silence remains, and in that silence, something ancient and human stirs. Grief. The Greeks still fought. The Trojans still defended their city. But for a moment, all of it became backdrop to one man's sorrow. Patroclus was no mere lieutenant to Achilles. He was a tether, a conscience, the reminder that life held more than blood and bronze. Their bond had been forged in laughter as much as battle, in small hours when no one watched. Some traditions call them lovers, others brothers in spirit. Homer is clear on one point. Achilles loved Patroclus above all. When that love was taken, the structure holding Achilles together came apart. Patroclus had led the Myrmidons, pushed the Trojans from the ships, and, against warning, raced to the gates. There he was struck, first by Euphorbus, then by the turn of fate, and finally by Hector. Hector stripped the shining armor, still not knowing whom he had felled, and claimed his victory. Dying, Patroclus spoke. Achilles would come, and this death would not end the war. It would open a new and darker door. Back in camp, Achilles heard. Some say Antilochus brought the news, gasping with grief. Some say a chorus of shattered survivors. Achilles fell to the ground and cried out, a sound not of wounded flesh but of a broken soul, a cry that shook tents, and some say moved gods. Thetis rose from the sea before he could even speak. He told her what he must do: return to war, kill Hector, avenge Patroclus, even if it meant his own death. The choice he once had, long life or blazing fame, no longer felt like a choice at all. Patroclus was gone. Only one road remained, but that road began with a burial. The Greeks fought to recover Patroclus's body. The Trojans pressed hard to seize it, hungry for armor and reputation, but Ajax and Menelaus held the line. Achilles himself strode to the field unarmored and shouted so fiercely the Trojans recoiled. Thetis, the loving mother and clear-eyed goddess, went to Hephaestus, and in divine fire he forged the new armor. Its great shield a small universe, fields and festivals, stars turning, the world continuing beyond any man's wrath. Achilles wore it anyway. Then came the funeral. In that culture, burial rites were sacred. To be left without them was a torment. Achilles promised more than a burial. He promised honor. They raised the pyre. Sacrifices were made. In one of the poem's darkest notes, Achilles killed 12 Trojan captives in Patroclus's name. Whether grief or fury drove him, it showed how far he had traveled into shadow. There were games as well, chariots, boxing, the javelin, not distractions but remembrance. For the Greeks, excellence in sport touched the divine, and so Patroclus would be ringed with honor even in death. Achilles cut a lock of his hair and placed it in Patroclus's hand, a small gesture that carried the weight of a world. He whispered promises, and the pyre was lit. Smoke climbed into the sky like a soul, and in that twilight between myth and memory, Patroclus passed into legend. Achilles did not find peace. He found purpose sharpened to a point. He turned his gaze to Troy's walls, toward Hector. To be fair, Hector had not killed out of spite. He defended his city and did not at first know who wore that armor. Subtleties like that do not survive grief. Achilles returned to the field like a blaze. He struck Trojans down without pause. He even defied the river god Xanthus, who pleaded with him to stop clogging his waters with the dead. When the river rose in fury, only the combined will of the gods drew Achilles out. Even Olympus struggled to contain him, and then at last Hector and Achilles met. This was no random clash. It was the duel that had been approaching for years, personal and inevitable. Hector waited outside the gates, knowing this hour must come. He stood for every person who fights because duty demands it, not desire. When Achilles arrived, Hector's courage faltered and he ran. 3 times they circled the walls while the city watched, until Athena, in the guise of Hector's brother, tricked him into standing. They faced one another, and the fight was swift. Achilles' spear found Hector's neck, and the prince fell. Death was not the end of Achilles' fury. He lashed Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust around the walls again and again, a desecration that even his comrades found hard to watch. He left the body near Patroclus' pyre. The camp fell quiet. Even the gods were troubled. Then something extraordinary happened. Priam, aged and unarmed, slipped into the Greek camp under Hermes' guidance and entered Achilles' tent. He fell to his knees, kissed the hands that had killed his son, and begged, not as a king, but as a father. Achilles wept. In Priam's face he saw Peleus, his own aging father. In Priam's grief he glimpsed his future. He lifted the old man, offered food, wept beside him, and returned Hector's body. For a moment, grief gave way to grace. No victory parade, no boast, only 2 men, broken by loss. Holding to a fragile thread of decency, Hector was buried with honor, mourned by Andromache, by Hecuba, and by Helen, who called him gentle, one of the few who had never blamed her. As for Achilles, he knew his end was near. He had done what he swore, avenged Patroclus, met his fate, and stepped into the kind of immortality only stories can grant. Some moments grow heavier as they pass through time, not because they are louder, but because something essential shifts within them. So it is with the duel that echoes across amphitheaters and ages, Achilles against Hector. It is not only strength meeting strength, but grief becoming rage, and then briefly remembering why we fight at all. Thetis had brought the world-carved shield. Life for an instant stood beside death. Achilles buried Patroclus with all the honor he could summon, even as he darkened his own soul to do it. In that mingling of love and fury lies the heart of the Iliad, a hero who chooses the echo over the quiet life, and learns too late how costly an echo can be. A brutal gesture, a reminder that Achilles' grief is still shaped like vengeance. Even in mourning he can't resist drawing blood. He holds funeral games, chariot races, boxing, javelin, less distraction than sacred rite. For the Greeks, to compete was to honor the dead. To strive in a friend's name was a kind of immortality. Old Nestor offers a running commentary on every contest. The Bronze Age's first sports pundit. When the fire burns low and only ashes remain, Achilles cuts his hair, once grown as a vow to the river god Spercheios, and lays the strands on Patroclus' body. Not a warrior now, a mourner. Then he turns toward Troy. Hector knows what's coming. He isn't foolish, nor driven by pride or prophecy. He's driven by duty. As Prince of Troy, he can't hide behind the walls, even as his wife Andromache begs him to stay. He tightens his armor and walks out alone. The city watches. Achilles approaches like a storm, not with speeches or heralds, but with a silence heavier than drums. 3 times Hector circles the walls, not from cowardice, but from instinct, recognizing that what bears down on him is less a man than a fate. At last Athena, in disguise, tricks him into standing fast, promising aid and vanishing when it matters most. The kind of divine interference that would make a chess referee weep. They fight. Hector's blows land, but Achilles wears armor forged by gods. Achilles strikes and Hector falls. Dying, Hector asks that his body be returned to his family. Achilles, consumed by wrath, refuses. He lashes Hector to his chariot and drags the body through the dust around the walls, past the weeping eyes of parents, wife, and even Helen, who once called Hector gentle. This desecration is more than cruelty. It violates everything sacred in Greek belief. Burial isn't a privilege, it's a right. Even enemies are owed their rights. But in his grief, Achilles breaks the code. And yet we do not turn away because he isn't a monster. He is a man in pain. He has lost the one person who steadied him, and without Patroclus he comes unmoored. The code of honor collapses under the weight of loss. For 12 days he drags Hector in circles, each morning new dust, each night new shame. Apollo preserves the body from decay, as if even the gods will not let this story rot too soon. The gods grow uneasy. Apollo begs for mercy. Zeus sends a message, enough, and so one final act begins. Priam, aged king of Troy, father of 50 sons and now bereft of almost all, slips into the Greek camp. No army, only a ransom and a sliver of hope. He enters Achilles' tent alone, kneels, and says in a voice lined with years, "I kiss the hands that killed my son." Something breaks. Achilles looks at Priam and sees Peleus, his own father. He sees his own end. He sees a world not built of victory and vengeance, but of grief passed from one person to another. He weeps. He lifts Priam from the ground, offers food, shelter, even comfort. There is a holiness in the quiet between them. They eat. They speak of fathers and children, of the things no poem quite captures. And then, without ceremony or bargain, Achilles returns Hector's body. The men sit not as enemies, but as fathers of the dead. For a brief moment the war stops. No trumpets, no declarations, just silence. Hector is buried. A great pyre is built. Andromache mourns. Hecuba weeps. Helen speaks too, calling him the only man in Troy who never shamed her. A reminder that even in war, kindness echoes louder than conquest. The defender of Troy passes into memory. And Achilles? He knows his own death is near, and for the first time, it doesn't matter. He has done what needed doing, not in battle, but in mercy. Here's the transformation, Achilles. Once a figure of wrath and unstoppable pride becomes, for one breath of story, something else, not warrior or son of prophecy, but a man who has felt the shape of sorrow and chosen compassion. The tide turns, not because the Greeks have won, but because their greatest hero shows that war is not always victory. Sometimes it is survival, sometimes it is letting go. Troy still stands, but the walls feel thinner. The gods no longer shout, and Achilles, our brightest, briefest flame, stands at the edge of his fate. The next arrow is already in flight. By now, the sands outside Troy are saturated with blood, yet the city stands. Heroes have come and gone. Gods have taken sides, changed their minds, and even joined the fighting. The greatest warrior the Greeks ever knew has returned, avenged his companion, and found, briefly, a fragment of peace. But the end, the distant thunder, grows louder. Achilles still stalks the field, terrifying and somehow still alive, but not for long. Let us speak of his death. Not because it is unexpected, but because in Greek myth it is terribly expected. The gods, Apollo in particular, have not forgotten Achilles' treatment of Hector. Apollo watched the dragging of the body, the defiance of burial rites, the rage that pushed beyond mortal bounds. When the time comes, he aids an unlikely figure, Paris. Paris is no hero. He is a lover, a charmer, a prince with good cheekbones and poor decisions. But with Apollo's guidance he takes up a bow, and when Achilles blazes too near the Scaean gates, Paris lets the arrow fly. Some say it strikes the heel, the place Thetis failed to protect. Others say it is the god's hand that makes it fatal. Either way, Achilles falls. No grand speeches, no slow-motion farewell, just the collapse of a man who burned too brightly for too long. The Greeks mourn, and then argue. Who will inherit Achilles' armor, the finest in the world, forged by Hephaestus and gleaming with divine artistry? 2 step forward, Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, strong, blunt, fiercely loyal, and Odysseus, son of Laertes, clever as a god and twice as persuasive. A contest is held. Ajax speaks of deeds, Odysseus of strategy. In the end, the armor goes to the man who turns words into weapons, Odysseus. Ajax is shattered. He had fought bravely, carried Achilles' body from the field, stood firm when others wavered, and now he is passed over. His honor, long bound to strength, unravels. In despair, he dies by suicide. Another hero ended, not in battle, but in sorrow. The Greeks burn his body quietly. Honor and shame remain intertwined, and still Troy stands. The war becomes tragic theater, each hero falling in turn, the gods withdrawing, perhaps embarrassed by what they helped create. The Greeks turn to prophecy, last resort when all else fails. 3 conditions must be met for Troy to fall. First, Achilles' son must fight at Troy. Second, the Greeks must retrieve the bow of Heracles. Third, the Palladium, Athena's sacred statue, must be taken from the city. They find Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, also called Pyrrhus, raised far from the war, young and untested, full of the fearless confidence of youth. When Odysseus fetches him, he agrees, not out of duty but destiny. He will finish what his father began. Next comes Philoctetes, a sore subject. Years earlier, bitten by a snake en route to Troy. He was abandoned on Lemnos with his festering wound, and with him the bow of Heracles, the one weapon prophesied to bring down Troy. Odysseus returns, full of apologies. Philoctetes is furious, but persuaded by the promise of redemption, he agrees. The bow returns to the war. The prophecy, piece by piece, aligns. The third task falls to stealth. The Palladium protects Troy. As long as it stands, the city cannot fall. Odysseus and Diomedes slip into Troy by night, scale the walls, and steal it. No flash, no flourish. Two men doing what armies could not. Now finally Troy is vulnerable, though not yet beaten. So comes the trick. Led by Odysseus, the Greeks build a wooden horse, massive, hollow, shaped as an offering to Athena. They leave it at Troy's gates and sail away, or so it seems. The Trojans find it, confused and debating. Laocoon warns them, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, and is then, rather dramatically, swallowed by sea serpents. The gods are not subtle. Meanwhile, Sinon, a Greek left behind, spins a tale of sacrifice and atonement and war's end. The horse, he claims, will bless Troy. Tired and hopeful, the Trojans pull it inside. What follows is a long night of revelry. After 10 years of siege, they finally have something to celebrate. Fires are lit, wine is poured, songs are sung. The city, weary but joyful, believes the war is over. But wars have one last act. At night the Greeks return. From the horse, warriors emerge, Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others. They open the gates. The fleet, hidden beyond the headland, surges in. Chaos follows. Temples burn. Families flee. Bronze clangs through narrow streets. Priam, the old king, is cut down at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, an act monstrous even in a blood-soaked economy. Hecuba is taken captive. Andromache, Hector's widow, is enslaved. Her child, Astyanax, is hurled from the walls, a cold calculation to prevent future vengeance. Helen is reclaimed by Menelaus, though not without tension. Some say he lifts his sword and she simply lets her robe fall. Old habits and the victors? They have won, yes, but what have they won? The city lies in ruins. Troy's treasures are loaded onto ships. The gods once so involved have gone quiet. The Greeks begin the long, uncertain journey home. Odysseus will wander 10 more years. Agamemnon will return to a household set against him. Menelaus will meander through Egypt before Sparta. The war ends, but the stories only begin. Victory in Greek myth is never clean. There is always a cost, a stain, a reckoning. The horse remains in memory, not as relic, but symbol. In the end, it wasn't strength that ended Troy, but a story, deception, cleverness. The long game of a man who could lie to a goddess and somehow get away with it. If Achilles is the peak of heroic wrath, Odysseus is cunning. The Greeks called it metis, not just cleverness, but strategic wisdom, the blade behind a smile, the whisper that ends wars. With fire-licking rooftops and history closing its book, the Trojan War ends. The cost is ruin. The reward, songs, sung across centuries of rage and love, of cities burned and legends born. And though the war is over, it echoes on, in Ithaca, in Rome, in every tale where pride meets fate and cleverness topples kingdoms. But that is another story. The war is over, and yet it is not. Troy has fallen. Its walls, once thought impregnable, crumble under deceit and fire. Streets choke with ash and sorrow. Bodies of princes and paupers lie alike beneath burning timbers. The air is thick with smoke, blood, and the ending of something vast. For those who survive, Greek and Trojan alike, the hardest part begins, the aftermath. The sack of Troy is not a battle. It is an unraveling. Once the horse delivers its payload and the gates are flung wide, violence has no structure. This is not honorable combat. It is chaos and revenge, the brutal final chapter of a 10-year fury. Priam seeks sanctuary at Zeus's altar, surrounded by symbols of protection, and begs for mercy. He receives none. The altar is defiled. The old order shatters. Hecuba is taken. Andromache is enslaved. Astyanax is slain to silence the future. Cassandra, doomed prophetess, clings to Athena's statue and is dragged away by Ajax the Lesser, destined to become Agamemnon's captive, a prize he will soon regret. Helen is found at last by Menelaus. Some say he intends to kill her. Some say she speaks a single word and lets her robe fall. Either way she lives, because the war has always been more complicated than it seems. For the Greeks, victory is not clean. Their religion demands proper rites, yet in Troy's sacked temples are looted, altars stained, sacred spaces profaned. For these offenses the gods do not remain silent. Storms rise. The journey home will be harder than the war. Agamemnon returns to Mycenae and meets a deadly reckoning. Cassandra dies with him, seeing all, stopping nothing. Menelaus and Helen are tossed across the Mediterranean, landing in Egypt. Years pass before Sparta. Even then, the shadow of Troy never leaves them. Helen becomes in Greek thought an uneasy symbol. To some, beauty and longing. To others, a cautionary tale. Odysseus' path becomes legend. His Odyssey is a 10-year trial of monsters, enchantresses, seductive voices, and a god's anger. Each encounter carries meaning. The Cyclops Polyphemus as the danger of brute force. Circe as the lure of comfort over duty. The Sirens as knowledge without consequence. In the end, it is not strength, but cleverness, endurance, and restraint that bring him home. Yet even he finds no easy welcome. Penelope is faithful but besieged by suitors. Telemachus is nearly grown. Strangers feast on his stores and mock his name. Homecoming is not triumph. It is reintegration. It is never easy. This theme, Nostos, the difficult return, becomes central to Greek literature. The war ends at Troy, but not in the hearts of the men who fought it, nor in the lands they returned to. Memory, trauma, and the burden of legend linger, paid in silence, restlessness, and night terrors. For the Trojans, other fates unfold. Aeneas, cousin to Hector, escapes with his father on his back and his son at his side, carrying the household gods into exile. Guided by visions, he becomes a story of survival and cultural rebirth. In time, as Roman poets will sing, his line leads to Rome, an empire born not in victory, but in escape, not in conquest, but in ruin survived. One empire falls, another rises. The Greeks have their epics. The Romans craft their own lineage from their enemies' ashes. History folds in on itself like that. Archaeology tells us Troy did burn around 1200 BCE, as the late Bronze Age cracked across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were destroyed or abandoned. Causes remain debated: invasion, internal collapse, climate shifts, trade disruptions, the so-called sea peoples among the suspects. Troy's burning fits a wider pattern. The myth is poetry, but its roots grip a historical earthquake of civilizations. So the Trojan War becomes more than war. It becomes a mirror. For later Greeks, a way to think about the cost of hubris, the complexity of fate, the fragility of civilization. A warning wrapped in epic, and a lament. Tragedians return to its characters. Euripides gives voice to Hecuba, Andromache, the women in the ruins. Sophocles explores Ajax's unraveling. Aeschylus imagines Agamemnon's return and the curse on his house. The battlefield becomes a stage. The glory becomes grief. The real aftermath is not victory but memory. And the figures who once seemed immortal gain new dimensions. Achilles, fierce and doomed. Hector, noble and burdened. Priam, the last light of a dying age. Odysseus, ever resourceful and ever lost. Their stories are retold and reinterpreted, from Homer to Virgil, from scroll to stage, from ancient epic to modern screen, because the Trojan War speaks to perennial truths: love and vengeance, loyalty and betrayal, fate and freedom. It isn't merely a tale of war. It's a meditation on endings, on the lives built after the fire dies and survivors learn to live in its glow. The war ends in flame, but its echoes, its names, questions, and sorrows never quite go quiet. So here, at the end of all things, we leave the ashes of Troy. The ships are gone. The gods have retreated. The heroes are dead or wandering, and the world somehow moves on. But somewhere in the background, always, there is a horse and a city that trusted it. The wind off the straits smells of salt and ash. It carries a hiss-like breath pulled through teeth, a sound that used to be the sea and is now unmistakably the past. At night the surf writes and rewrites the shoreline where Troy stood, and in the morning the sentences have changed. People will later claim the gods turned their faces away, that they let mortals learn how to be gods for a single terrible evening. But there are still traces, footprints that go nowhere, embers that refuse to cool, and a silence in the sky where thunder used to live. In the hush after ruin, stories rearrange themselves. The war has ended. The endings have not. They march at daybreak. Chains are not always iron. Some are stitched from fear, some from promises, some from the careful calculations of survival. Andromache walks with the other women down a road that used to lead to market stalls bright with figs and copper bowls. The dust is new, the grief is not. She keeps her shoulders square because that is how Hector stood when the city needed him to be taller than he was. She tells herself she is not the last wall of Troy, but she straightens anyway. Beside her, Hecuba mutters names like beads on a string. Each name is a door she taps to make sure it still exists. Priam, Polyxena, Cassandra. She doesn't say the last name. She never says the last name because some doors should remain shut lest the room behind them flood the hallway. Guard tries to be kind and offers water. The amphora looks like something from before, an object that doesn't know it's been promoted to relic. Andromache takes a sip, then passes it on. The kindness could be a tactic, a sugar thrown into the mouth of a horse. It could be kindness. She doesn't investigate further. She has learned not to stare directly at ambiguity. At the turn of the road where the ground darkens with seeping springs, a girl breaks from the line and runs toward the cliffs. One of the soldiers, too young, too eager, lunges to catch her. His hand closes on air. The women do not gasp. They do not cry out. Their silence is a blanket thrown over a flame until it chokes. Another soldier steps in front of the runner, not to stop her, but to remove the cliff from her path, to speak to her with hands open and voice soft. The girl stops. She shakes. She turns back. The first soldier looks confused. The second looks old. The line continues. That night the sky is unbuttoned and full of stars. Hecuba sleeps with her hands clenched as if she's still holding a crown, and Andromache lies awake listening to the slow tide of breath around her. The women, the guards, the horses, the crackle of a fire that insists on being a river. She thinks of Astyanax and does not let the memory sharpen. She keeps it dull like a wooden knife that won't split her open if she trips. When she finally sleeps, she dreams of a house whose rooms can fold into pockets. She wakes to a whisper. Lady, it's a voice she knows from the old days, a servant who never moved like a servant, thin as a reed but unbendable. Barreau, Andromache says, surprised at her own voice for remembering how to say a name with gentleness. Barreau points to the shadows at the edge of camp. A shape stands there, neither fleeing nor approaching. For a heartbeat, Andromache thinks it is Hector. The mind will rent costumes to ghosts when it must. But the figure is shorter, wrapped in a travel-stained cloak that knows every road between here and the islands. Speak, Andromache says, and the figure steps forward. It is not Hector. It is not a ghost. It is a boy with eyes too intent for his years. I came for the old queen, he says, and for you if you wish it. His accent is Troas and something else, a shoreline tongue. Aeneas sends word along the roots of the mountains. There are havens. Havens. Hecuba's eyes open. The word is a herb rubbed between fingers, could be perfume, could be poison. What kind of havens survive after this? The kind that do not look like havens, the boy answers. The kind that are doors disguised as walls. Andromache stands. Her wrists are unbound tonight, more out of exhaustion than mercy. She thinks. She thinks again. Go to Hecuba, she says to Barreau. If the queen wishes it, we will try at dawn. Barreau nods. The boy fades back into the trees. The fire pretends it didn't see. Odysseus names every rope because he believes you tie things better when you can curse them personally. The sailcloth hums. The oars knock time on the sockets, old bones complaining at familiar work. He is not far from the shore where shadows carry Troy in their pockets, but distance at sea is a trickster's measure. You can be a morning away from one place and a lifetime away from what it did to you. His crew doze in shifts, dreaming in the language of the sea, fish-like and without punctuation. He sits by the stern with his back to the wake and his eyes on the forward dark. He is glad the stars are steady. It is a professional courtesy he appreciates. They say a man can have too many clever thoughts for a boat, that they weigh it down and attract storms. Odysseus suspects storms like clever men just fine. The trick is to make them think they thought of you first, A gull lands on the gunwale as if hired to be a messenger. In its beak is a sliver of reed with a dot of wax sealing a strip of bark. Odysseus laughs despite himself. He's taught his son a game with reeds and notes, and now the sea returns the favor. He's about to pluck the note free when the gull cocks its head, offended. "All right," he says. "I will pay your fee." He tosses a scrap of salted meat, and the bird, now mollified, hops closer. Odysseus breaks the wax, unrolls the bark. The letters are cramped and salt-blurred. The hand is not Greek. He reads, and the boat seems to lean in. It is a warning, short, practical, almost polite. The handwriting belongs to someone who has learned how to fit a road into a sentence. The message says, "Do not trust smooth islands. Do not turn your back on statues. Do not sleep on shore the first night." It is signed with a small mark like a spearhead and a single line. There are havens. There are also mouths that say haven. Odysseus folds the strip and tucks it inside the leather of his bracer. The bird, having completed this small theater, takes off without a glance. "We will not sleep on shore," he tells the helmsman, who grunts without waking. "And if you see an island that looks more like a promise than a piece of rock, steer as if it insulted your mother." The helmsman grunts again. The stars keep their appointments. Odysseus leans back, and for the first time since the horse's belly went dark, he smiles at a horizon. Not all ruins are inert. Some learn new forms of breathing. Aeneas moves like water around stones. He is one of those men who can stand perfectly still without suggesting stasis, as if standing were simply another way of traveling. With him are the old men whose bones have conspired to become cane and compass, the young whose eyes keep trying to grow old too fast, and children who count what can be counted and make legends of the rest. Anchises, his father, walks on his own today. The old man pretends he does it to study the sky. But everyone knows a son's shoulders are already a city, and cities ought not be loaded when a road is uncertain. They have found a hollow in the hills where river and rock hold a conversation, and the earth remembers how to offer shelter. It is not Troy. Nothing is Troy. But it is a place where a house might one day forget it is a tent. Aeneas orders that no fire be lit on the highest ridge, and that no name be spoken aloud for the place, not yet. To name a haven too soon is to fix it in the gods' attention like an insect on a pin. The household gods ride with them in a small chest that smells like pepper and pine. At night they set the figures out and speak to them without asking for anything extravagant. Guard our sleep. Bless the bread. If you must be jealous of storms, not of us. Ilioneus comes back from scouting with a look that Aeneas trusts. "Track," he says. "2 groups. One heavy, many feet, likely captives and guards. One light, 3 or 4 at most, moving opposite. Fast." "Friends of the first group," Aeneas says, not asking, because the right statement can open the door faster than the right question. "Likely," Ilioneus agrees. "I left signs in the pines," Aeneas nods. He thinks of how a city is built. Not of walls first, but of agreements. Clay follows language. He looks around at faces that all want the same thing in different flavors. Safety, bread, meaning that doesn't feel borrowed. "We will widen the hollow," he says. "We will turn the river slightly. We will teach our children to walk like river stones, rounded, patient, hard to break. And if the gods find us?" Someone asks. "Then we will stand up and move again," Aeneas says, and no one laughs because it is not a joke. Menelaus has a way of turning a map into a confession. He unrolls it on the deck, puts a finger on a bay that looks like an ear, and says, "Here is where I made a promise I could not keep." He taps a notch in an island that resembles a bitten coin. "Here is where we paid for saying the wrong prayer at the right altar." Helen listens. She sits like a statue that once had paint. The light has been scraped off her name the way time scrapes gold from a temple frieze, leaving the shape but not the shine. She understands that some stories have put her at the center as if she were a fire. She also understands that a center is only a center when measured from somewhere else. When Menelaus asks her which course to take around a reef, she answers without poetry. She has learned the map of practical things, windbanks, the grammar of gull flights, the way a distant cliff darkens when it is hoarding weather. One afternoon, a sail appears on the horizon, a triangle with a chip missing, like a tooth. The watchman calls and the crew bustle to look useful. Menelaus reaches for his spear, then does not. Helen stands and shades her eyes. She makes a sound that is not surprise. Menelaus hears it and knows it is a sound from before. He squints. The other ship swings toward them with a jaunty confidence that is either bravery or excellent timing. When it draws close enough for voices to cross, a man stands on the prow and shouts, "I am here to sell you a story." He grins as if he has already won a game that hasn't been taught yet. Menelaus blinks. "We are poor buyers. We paid for one story with 10 years. "Then you know the currency," the man says and laughs. "I am Sinon, and I am good at beginnings." Helen's mouth tightens. "Yes," she murmurs. He is. Sinon keeps laughing. "Do not worry, Lady of Names. I do not sell the same story twice." He vaults onto their deck with a gymnast's ease and bows. Too deep, too theatrical, a man who believes performance wards off curses. "I have news from the Capes. There are storms that do not belong to the season. There is a god who has taken offense at how mortals confuse offerings with bribes." "Which god?" Menelaus asks. "Whichever one you least wish to hear about," Sinon says, and then, for once, drops his smile. "You will want to avoid the islands that pretend to be quiet. Everyone is writing that message this season," Helen says. Sinon shrugs. "Perhaps the gods have decided the living need a warning they can read. Or perhaps," Menelaus says, "men who have learned to lie to gods can also learn to warn strangers." It is not an insult. It is almost a toast. They trade water, bread, and rumors. Sinon departs with a flourish and a promise to meet again, where a river thinks it is the sea. Menelaus stares after him until the sail shrinks to a stitch. Helen returns to the map. She finds the river that has told that lie and lays a finger nearby. "Here," she says. "If there is trouble, it will collect there like fallen leaves in a bend. And if there is safety, it will be uphill and slightly east." Menelaus doesn't ask how she knows. He has learned the shape of a truth you get from being treated like an emblem. What is taken from you is replaced by an eye for currents. The boy who visited Andromache's camp comes by a different name, depending on who asks. He answers to all of them because a road requires more than one pair of shoes. To the Greeks he is Petros, thin-faced, a mule with a map's memory and a deliberate smile. To the Trojans he is Meles, born under a comet and as stubborn. He carries a door on his back, a thing made of 3 slats and 2 cross pieces, the size of a small table, bleached river wood. He says it is just wood. People whisper that it is a door that can lead you somewhere else if you lean it against the right piece of sky. He walks from camp to camp, ruin to ruin, and listens. He puts sorrow into categories, not to cheapen it, but to make sure none of it gets lost. "Walkers," he says softly to himself after one morning, "and sitters, and those who pretend to be walls." He collects names like a sower collects seed points, even from those who think they are done being named. The door is a joke, a charm, a rumor. Some nights, when the air grows clear as a knife blade, he sets the door against a mound and asks a question out loud. He never receives an answer that can be repeated. What comes instead is a sense that the world has rooms where halls used to be, that a ruin can be a hinge if you push at the right place. At dawn after his visit to Andromache, he returns to the pines where he left signs for Ilioneus. The signs are gone. In their place, a mark has been carved into bark, a curved line capped by a point, midway between a smile and a spear. He grins. "Ah," he says to the tree, "that one." He turns his door and begins to walk toward a hollow he has never seen but somehow knows. He has learned a secret. Foundations call to each other, even when they have no house to support. The hollow that Aeneas found is a letter written to the sky. From above it would look like a hand half curled, ready to shelter a flame. Into this, Aeneas brings the remnants of ceremonies, the bits of ritual that can be carried like bread. Pour water for the forgotten. Sweep a threshold even when there is no door. Greet the morning as if it were a guest. Ilioneus returns with Barrow and the boy with the door. They bring news. A column of captives turned early. Theirs are being marched to the ships in 3 days' time. The boy speaks without preamble. If we move quickly, we can give them a path that looks like an accident. Aeneas studies him. He recognizes a kind of courage that is mostly math. What would you need? Nothing that looks like a banner, the boy says. And nothing that sounds like a prayer. They plan without calling it planning. The best plans are conversations that refuse to end in a period. They mark the ground with pebbles and call them sheep, so that the gods, if they listen, will hear a pastoral scene and not a rescue. The door becomes a table for maps and bread. The household gods are set near enough to warm the bread and far enough to avoid hearing too many details. That night, after the last voice drops off the edge of wakefulness, Aeneas steps away from the fire. He carries a small cup of wine. He has been careful not to demand too much from the gods. Survivors know you ask for clear feet and a steady hand, not lightning. He holds up the cup. For those who stand watch, he says quietly, to men, to women, to forces that do not sign their messages. He drinks, then pours a little on the ground. The earth is thirsty, but it returns a scent like rain. The path to the Greek camp is a scroll unrolled along the low cliffs. The sea gnaws below in the way of seas, indifferent to all titles. The guards have been told that this stretch is easy and that the gods have become bureaucrats. Danger can be scheduled, which is to say avoided with a good list. The boy with the door knows better. So does Barreau, who can read the shape of a shoreline like some reed faces. At a bend where the wind always shouts and the gulls always gossip, a section of ground gives way, though not entirely by accident. The soil, already chewed by rain and season, crumbles like bread past its date. A cart laden with amphora tips. The line halts. The guards curse in rhythms that have not yet become music. Andromache looks up the cliff, and her eyes meeting Barrow's is the only signal required. There is no mad dash, no cinematic leap. There is shuffling. There is confusion. There is a soldier who chooses to tie a rope before looking to his left. There is a gust of wind that slaps a cloak into a face. There is a moment where attention gets tired, and there is a door leaning against a rock, standing where it has no right to stand. Andromache does not ask. She slips toward it, not running, not creeping, just moving as if the space between her and the door had finally remembered it was a hallway. Hecuba is at her shoulder with a queen's casual audacity. Even in chains, some people have the knack of walking like the world is their house. Barreau steadies the door without touching it. They step through. On the other side, there is a smell of thyme and river silt and the sound a small waterfall makes when it thinks no one is listening. Aeneas stands there with his hand out and a look on his face like a door closing softly. It takes 3 breaths, one for disbelief, one for recognition, one for the word later. Then the hollow erupts in quiet work. Women are fed and given water. Children are handed tasks that are both useful and calming. Count the bees. Tie these knots. Teach us the names of your brother's friends. Aeneas kneels to Hecuba and does not say queen. He says, your hands, mother, and she, who once ruled with scepters, realizes that rule can be a hand warmed between 2 others. Back on the path, a guard looks up to find an extra cart where there shouldn't be one. He scratches his head. He counts heads and miscounts. He tightens a strap and decides the numbers have a way of changing when you look too hard. He kicks the dirt and tells himself that one more woman means one less job to do later. The line moves on. The door, now relieved of its guests, looks like wood again. The boy hefts it, grinning, and follows the dust back to the hollow. They do not light a large fire. Aeneas insists on many small ones, so smoke rises like quiet opinions instead of a column someone could read from miles away. Bread is warmed on flat stones. Water is poured from high so it remembers falling rain. The rescued women unwrap their griefs the way you unwrap a bundle after a journey, carefully, and with the knowledge that something inside may be broken. Hecuba sits with a bowl of broth doctored with garlic and sage. She blows on it as if cooling a blade. Andromache keeps her hands busy, which is easier than keeping her mind so. Barreau moves like a hinge, opening one conversation, closing another, always where a door would be. The boy leans his door against a boulder and watches with the proprietary satisfaction of a mason who sees a wall take shape. Aeneas joins him. They look like a bridge and its river deciding which one is older. What is that thing not to be named? Aeneas asks without pointing. A door, the boy answers, which is to say occasion, argument, riddle. Does it tire? It is wood, the boy says, as if that explains both everything and nothing. If wood tires, it creaks. It has creaked. Where did you get it? I made it. Out of boards cut from trees that had dreamed of other rooms. He grins. I will tell you the whole of it when we are accounting for things worth keeping. Tonight? After the 3rd story, the boy says, the truth is easier. Tonight, then, Aeneas agrees. He does not add if there is a tonight here. Survivors learn to omit words that tempt gods. Children begin to name the hollow, which is how places acquire and shed their titles. Nest, one says. Cup, says another. Aeneas overhears and says nothing. A place is a container first, a promise only later. Let it be a nest and not yet a city, a cup and not yet a flagon. Toward evening, a thin rain comes like a messenger who forgot her coin. It slicks the fig leaves, makes the dirt take a breath. Hecuba steps out from under a canvas. Let it wash the words the Greeks spoke over us, she says. And no one argues because washing is good even when it accomplishes nothing a priest could measure. When darkness finally lays down, they arrange watchers. The boy offers a trick. If you hang bells made from shell and bead on thread, wind will speak in a tongue a thief does not understand. They string the threads low to the ground so goats won't announce themselves as gods. The beads chatter in the light damp, saying nothing and everything, like cousins at a wedding. The household gods, brown with handling and sea sweat, are set on a stone and fed crumbs. Aeneas's son, Ascanius, kneels and whispers a piece of nonsense to them, the way children neutralize a curse by making it laugh. The gods, who have seen empires fall and rise on the hinge of a mispronounced name, accept the crumb as if it were a cow. When all is set to rights for the night, Aeneas returns to the boy. 3 stories, he says. The boy nods. 1. When the horse went into Troy, I was on the ridge above the Scaean gate, selling fish that were really eels, and eels that were really lies. I saw men I did not know look at the city with the eyes of men who have already lived there in their heads. It is dangerous to be imagined by someone who hates you. 2. After the burning, I walked along the river and found 3 planks among reeds, unburned because they had been wet with laundry water. A woman had washed a child's tunic there and set it to dry, then fled. The planks had absorbed the soap and the child's smell. I took them because they matched, and I thought a matched thing should not be separated again. 3. A carpenter in a village that had once refused all poetry because of an old stupid curse agreed to show me how to join the planks with pegs from olive wood. I said it was to make a table. He did not ask why I carried it on my back like a priest carries a god. The boy touches the door. When I set it upright for the first time, a breeze went through it that was not the wind. You know. He searches Aeneas's face. I know, Aeneas says, and he does. Some things do not stand. They face. So I carried it. The boy concludes, as if the conclusion were the obvious summary to an improbable proof, in case we needed a face. They sit together without speaking. In the distance, someone tells a story about Hector teaching the city children to box with padded hands so they would learn when not to strike. The story ends abruptly, because endings are rude, and the night continues to knit. Odysseus keeps his promise to an anonymous warning and his own paranoia. On the 2nd day after the gull, they make a smooth island by noon, exactly the sort an easy god would build on a cheerful afternoon. Low slopes like shoulders, olive trees shaped by patient hands, a shoreline that seems to smile with perfect white stones. The crew hums in their throats. Men know the shape of comfort the way wolves know the shape of firelight. No shore the first night, Odysseus says, not loudly. He plays with a knotted rope, fingers thinking a double thought. We cast anchor and sleep on the water. Watch in threes, no singing with words that promise things. And if anyone has a statue in his bag he has been planning to give to a god to buy mercy, he throws it overboard now. What if it is a family god? The helmsman asks, pitching his voice to the humor that makes orders digestible. Then the family is on the boat, Odysseus says, and the boat is god enough tonight. They do as he says, because he has the look of a man who has already argued with fate and only lost twice today. They drift within earshot of the island, enough to hear goats and wind, not enough to smell the interesting spices that a village always keeps for sale. In the hour when the sky considers dawn, a low noise rolls from the island, soft as a house exhaling. On the shore something changes. Men on the second watch sit up, the way dogs do when a cart they know by sound comes down the road. Odysseus stands without standing, one fluid move that keeps the boat's center of gravity loyal. He looks. The shoreline's smile has become very still. The olives are arranged with a care that feels newly intentional. He whispers a thought. Statues, he says to the helmsman, but not the temple sort. The sort put up by what loves to be looked at but never touched. Not gods? Not gods we can sue, Odysseus says. We hold to our decision. They hold. The island does its work without them. Later, when the sun has burned the night's tricks down to their stumps, they row on, leaving a smooth promise unopened. Odysseus keeps his eyes forward and thinks about the subtle way desire always spells itself with too many letters. After midday, the sea delivers a second note. No bird this time. Foam gathers at the prow, and when it recedes, something clings in the grain of wood, a thin scrap of woven reed, knotted twice. His hand knows how to open it before his mind does. Inside, a bit of bark with 4 words, river with salt dreams. Odysseus grins. He loves riddles when they smell like maps. "We have an appointment," he tells the crew. The helmsman raises an eyebrow that says, "Of course we do." The men row as if they were going home. In the hollow, the rescued bring their recipes with them. These are not written. They are positions of fingers in the way you listen to a simmer, the way you listen to a child. Andromache kneads dough with steady fury, teaching anger to be gluten. Beside her, a girl named Thalia, no one knows whether that is the name she was born to, shows how to tuck herbs into the seam so the bread, once baked, opens its own little pockets of green. Hecuba takes a stool as throne and declares with sweet imperiousness that the smallest loaves go first to those who turn back from the cliff. Even when the gods are not generous, she says, we can embarrass them with our imitation. Aeneas walks the perimeter, counting feet, measuring silence, assigning tasks with a voice that does not look like authority because it is disguised as asking. He sees men who were soldiers and are now men. He sees women who were queens and are still queens. He sees children who have discovered that a tent flap can be a curtain and a curtain can be a stage. The boy with the door sits with Ascanius and a blue-eyed child from the captives who refuses every question except one. "What is your favorite sound?" the boy asks, offering the safest of all queries. The child thinks. "When someone knocks," he says finally, "but not when I'm alone." He touches the wood of the door, as if the answer could be saved there. The boy nods and resists the urge to give 3 answers of his own. As dusk sifts down, Ilioneus returns from the ridges with news. A sail, and then another, carrying Argive pride and pirate economy. Also, there are goats who have acquired opinions about us. "We are collecting the world," Aeneas says. "We had better decide what kind to be." "Large and quiet," Barreau suggests. "Like an old dog that scares wolves without standing." "Quick and mean when we must," says a woman whose brother died at the gate. "But only when we must." "And clever," the boy puts in, "because the gods like to test for that." Hecuba waves a hand. "Let the gods test each other and leave us out of their school," she says. We are busy. Sinon, merchant of beginnings, makes a camp where the river broadens its tongue and pretends to speak sea. He has traded gossip for dates and dates for copper and copper for an old story about a girl who outsmarted a king by moving his bed 1 handbreadth every night. He laughs to himself and places his bed where the ground is flattest. He does not sleep immediately. Men like him do everything on a delay. The river glugs around his ankles like a drunk uncle giving advice. Over his low fire he warms a flat cake and an opinion that the world is full of mouths, and the trick lies in knowing which ones eat and which ones speak. Before he can decide which opinion to sleep on, a shadow moves across his fire and sits. He does not reach for his knife. He knows a few silhouettes well enough to leave knives wrapped. "Helen," he says, "like a toast that wants to be water." "Sinon," she returns, not smiling, because her smile is not a thing she spends on old colleagues, and perhaps because it is freighted currency. It buys too much. Menelaus comes behind, placing his spear where conversation can see it. "We meet again," he says. He has the face of a man practicing the art of not making a scene. He is good at it. "A decade of scenes cured him on that score. You'll not want to camp on the sand," Sinon says, gesturing with his bread. She has a memory for men who think she is only pretty. The river, the curve, the place where wind forgets to warn you. "We'll be on the grass," Helen decides, "and if you have a story to sell, sell only the part that isn't rotten." Sinon laughs softly. "You always go straight to the red dye." He tips his cup toward the dark upstream. Another ship comes. Either an old friend with new ambitions or a new friend with old debts. Helen looks into what he looks into and says nothing. Menelaus exhales through his nose, which is a kind of prayer. They move their camp 3 body lengths. It feels like very little. It saves exactly enough. The girl who had run for the cliff and run back sits by Andromache's fire, hands glossy with oil from kneading. She wears her hair short because someone cut it in a hurry and never apologized. She watches Andromache's face while pretending to watch the bread. It is a trick children learn when they want the answer without asking the question. "You are Andromache," the girl says at last, picking the safest fact out of the basket. "I have been," Andromache answers. "I am this woman now. What do I call you?" "Andromache." The girl nods as if she'd guessed correctly on a little test. "When I ran," she says, "I was not going to—" She stops, caught by the net of a rule she has made for herself. Do not say that word. Do not name that cliff. I was going to ask the sea if it remembered me. If it said yes, I would have let it keep me. If it said no, I would have come back. And what did it say? The girl frowns. The sea speaks in lists. I decided not to wait for the part where I was on it. She glances sideways. Does that make sense? It makes the kind that matters, Andromache says. I have also decided to be on fewer lists. She folds the dough. Will you carry water and not spill any? It's a job for a runner. The girl flushes with a holy pride. I will not spill a drop, she promises, and Andromache gives her a jar big enough to make the promise interesting. Later, Barreau leans over. You are building a city out of jobs. Clay follows language, Andromache says, and hears Aeneas in her mouth with a small, uncomfortable joy. Also, I am building a city out of girls who do not jump. Barreau looks at the girl, who moves with the concentration of a priest at a knot. We were always going to need such bricks, she says. On a ridge above the river that thinks it is sea, a bandit chief and his men are learning new math. Before the war, they were coin shavers and cattle thieves. During the war, they collected the leavings of armies and called it intermediary work. After the war, they have been attempting to decide what to be. The chief, who was named Laertes before anyone had heard of any other Laertes, sits with his back to an olive and makes an inventory. 5 men who will do anything if you say it in the tone their fathers used. 2 who only want meat. 1 who composes in his head speeches to women he never meets. And a boy who cannot stop smiling even when he should. Ships, says Meat, shading his eyes with a dirty hand. People who might be ships, says Speeches. People who might be stories. People who might pay, says the chief. He has a scar across his mouth that makes him look like he's always just told a joke he regrets. They watch Menelaus put his camp where Helen says. They watch Sinon sleep as if he were awake somewhere else. They see another sail, lower, busy with some internal conversation, men moving like carved words, deliberate and legible. The chief rocks once and says, We will not attack the men whose woman can steer the wind with a finger, and the liar who tells God rumors. We will try the next ship that looks easier. This is an example of how bandit chiefs sometimes keep their bandits alive. Gods, looking down, mark him for later punishment and then forget, because the sky is a large office and memos get misfiled. The rope gives when the shadow reaches the length of a goat. The log behaves responsibly. The column stutters, all knees and counting. Barreau's bees perform their small theater. 3 women and 2 boys step through the door as if it were nothing more than morning. A 6th, older, stubborn, refuses to be saved by trick and simply walks away from the column when no one is looking, which is its own kind of miracle. Wolf coughs once to drown the sound of joy. Sinon praises a guard's common sense until the man forgets to be cruel. Menelaus stands like a post where Panic would like a gate. Panic decides to try another field. Odysseus has his hands laced behind his back and the careful honesty of a man standing at an altar. The door is well behaved. It is the last time they use it that way. That night, Fog comes back with a compliment that thinks it is a siege. Hecuba refuses with bread and grammar. Cassandra hums the wrong key until the Fog, tone-deaf and offended, wanders off. The hollow sleeps, and the door, satisfied with its day's arithmetic, leans against the boulder like a tired standard. At dawn, the boy sets his palm to the grain and feels what he has been avoiding. Rest. Not refusal. Not exhaustion. The simple limit a tool speaks when it knows its proper size. Enough, he says to Aeneas. Enough, Aeneas agrees, because leaders also lead in stopping. The carpenter oils it once more with lamb fat and thyme. Menelaus exhales onto the wood with the calm of a man who has made peace with at least one account. The door shivers, terribly pleased, then settles into its own weight. It wants to lie down, the carpenter says. As a threshold, Hecuba murmurs, and smiles like a woman accepting a sensible proposal after a long day of bad ones. So they choose the place, not central, not high, not a stage, a path where feet have already taught the dirt how to be patient. They dig, children first for luck, men and women next for sense, and lay flat a bed of pebbles that clack together like teeth-telling jokes. They lower the door, horizontal for the first time in its useful life. It fits. Of course it fits. It has always been learning their weight. The boy kneels. From now, he tells it, be crossed. Aeneas steps over, right foot then left, and does not look back, because some ceremonies need that discipline. Hecuba crosses with her hands open. Andromache crosses with the runner girl, who whispers numbers to the grain until numbers turn into names. Odysseus crosses with his ankles cocked to listen. Menelaus crosses and does not flinch at the creak. It sounds like a promise kept. Helen crosses with a basket and no ribbon in her hair, and the expression women wear when they are done being statues. Cassandra crosses and does not prophesy, which is, for her, a profound generosity. Wolf crosses and pays his toll in vegetables and silence. Sinon crosses and, for once, does not compose in his head the price of an ending. The door becomes a threshold, and a threshold becomes a city. Not immediately. Aeneas forbids the word for a while longer. He says camp and nest and cup because he is playing chess with gods and does not intend to tell them where his king will live. But the work changes shape. Posts go into ground and do not come back out. A ditch becomes a wall by admitting it is a moat. The household gods acquire a roof of woven reeds, and then, improbably, tiles that Ilioneus and two boys fire in a pit after Cassandra teaches them how to make clay argue correctly with heat. The traveler's clay god sits beside them and smells soup through holes the carpenter drilled like little moons. Wolf returns fewer coins than he could extort, and more sheep than anyone expected. He engineers the kind of peace that looks like a tax and feels like a courtesy. Meat learns to be gentle with goats. Speeches learns to keep them shorter. The Greeks drift like pollen. The column thins to rumor. Menelaus reads the wind and the map, which is now also the faces of men. He knows when a hound is pulled by a trail that is not his. One morning he straps on a smaller ambition and rises. Helen ties up a bundle the weight of which is mostly story. They stand at the threshold together. Hecuba meets them there. "You are done here," she says, without either sneer or blessing. "We are done not being done," Helen answers, which Hecuba grudgingly approves. "You will not take any of our names," Hecuba adds. "Only our own," Menelaus assures her. They cross. Menelaus feels the wood speak under his sandal. Not ours now, and that is all right. Helen pauses, kneels, and fits her palm to the grain the way a woman greets a dog she has decided not to own. Then she goes. Odysseus lingers longer because he owes the world one last cleverness. At the river bend he meets Sinon, who has already packed 3 beginnings and 2 regrets. "You'll sell us kindly?" Odysseus asks. "I'll sell us as if it mattered," Sinon replies. "And you?" Sinon adds, cocking his head toward the east, where the sea rehearses being kind. "I have a son," Odysseus says, "and a house that resents me less than it used to. I will lean my cleverness against its doorframe and see if it creaks the right way." They clasp forearms because neither trusts his tongue entirely. Odysseus wades to his boat, speaks once with his ankles, and the river gives him a push only he can feel. His sail picks up the rumor of a wind. The island that smiles too much pretends to be shy. He does not stop there. Wolf watches him go. "That one is a threshold too," he says, to no one in particular. "Back in the hollow that isn't. The work refuses to be shy." The runner girl grows into a runner woman with calves like promises. She still counts when she is afraid. Andromache becomes the spine of a street that does not yet know it will be a street. Her doorpost is where directions begin. Her pot is where hunger forgets itself. She teaches children to say their names as if they were tools that ought to be kept clean. Ascanius collects boys and girls with quick hands and quicker ears and drills them, not in spear, which will come anyway if the world insists, but in knots, in loads, in how to turn a fire low when the wind looks nosy. He is good at command because he can make a suggestion sound like a memory you meant to have. Cassandra weaves strips of bark with words pressed into them. Not prophecies. Not quite, but instructions for how to carry rain inside a shirt without telling the sky. She hangs them on pegs by the new gate. Travelers read and scoff and then, sometimes, survive because of them. Hecuba takes petitions and naps. The naps acquire an authority, petitions do not. When she dies, she does it as if lying down in the shade after a long market day. They cover her with a cloth the color of figs. They do not carve her name in stone. They rename the wind the first time it arrives warm after snow and let that be her. The household gods accept the exchange without complaint. The carpenter grows old the way a handle polishes. He builds a bench along the threshold and says nothing while he watches feet. One morning he does not rise. The bench keeps the dent of his hip. Boys who never met him sit there and understand chisels without knowing why. The city of fog tries a last time. It sends a caravan of gentleness, women who bake without asking names, men who speak like door-to-door weather. They lay out cloth the color of surrender and say forever only once. Hecuba is already wind. Cassandra is already busy teaching a child how to step between lines. Aeneas has learned to count without wanting tribute. Andromache knows exactly how many knives are clean. The delegation is welcomed, fed, not adopted. At dusk, Wolf's men escort them away with compliments. The fog takes the hint and spends itself on a mountain that does not care. Season by season, the hollow forgets to be shy. It picks up habits. Market, threshing, an argument over where to put the bake oven that is settled when the traveler's clay god tips forward on a shelf and survives the fall. There, Cassandra says, and everyone agrees, because sometimes you let objects make the small decisions so they will leave you alone about the large. Aeneas sends scouts up river and down. He speaks with villages that once hid because hubris has a long reach. He barters for seed and for songs. He learns a path west that tastes of ash and milk and says later to his bones. When the later comes, he will go. Boats and deals with kings and the long spine of a story that pretends to be about Rome while being about bread. For now he stays, because staying is also a kind of voyage. One winter, a storm arrives that is a god wearing weather so convincingly, even Cassandra gives it the courtesy of her attention. The wind means to take the roof of the shrine of humble tools. Aeneas and Ascanius brace the beams. Andromache and the runner-woman pass up stones. Menelaus is long gone. Odysseus is elsewhere. Sinon has rebranded regret as a luxury item in 3 ports. Wolf ties the corners with a new tax called rope. The storm breathes hard. Then the threshold creaks, one long, pleased sound, and the wind, close enough to hear manners, lowers its voice and passes on. In spring, they raise a real gate where once a door pretended to be one. It is not grand. It is made from wood that knew a house before. Over it, carved by the carpenter's last student with a steadiness that makes his hands ache, they set a small sentence. We refuse certain things. Strangers stop and smile. The city keeps its promises like a ledger, small entries, balanced. Helen and Menelaus pass back through years later, older as true nouns are. Their ship anchors in the river mouth for one night while the sea talks about taxes. They do not come ashore. They sit on deck and look inland. A boy, no longer a boy, runs along the ridge with a message no horn can carry. Wolf's son breaks a signal fire with a boot because he still likes the sound. Helen laughs once softly. Menelaus closes his eyes and sees a door lying flat under feet he will never count and is comforted. Odysseus, very far away, makes a threshold of his own, a plank worn by hands he has learned to keep clean. On a night when the wind forgets his name and remembers it again with affection, he feels, absurdly, a creak through his ankle bones that must have found its way along rivers and roots to him. He smiles into his cup and tells no one. Some gifts are domestic, years spool. Children who once counted knots count measures of grain. The runner woman ages into a voice that can stop a fight by naming the wrong sort of pride in it. Cassandra goes gray and is believed in little things. Don't sleep under a roof you did not watch being built. Don't let the city learn your name before you learn hers. She accepts the scale. It is good. Aeneas stands one dawn with his hand on the gate and the other on a boy's shoulder. His boy, suddenly taller where the knives are kept. We'll go, he says, and the boy says, we'll come back. And both sentences are true enough to serve. They walk to the threshold. The city, which has been practicing for this, does not cry. It sends them with breads that travel well and a joke for the gods. At the edge, Cassandra ties a strip of bark to the traveler's clay god's box. River with salt dreams. Trust ankles. She nods to the threshold. We won't move you, she tells it. You are the hinge in the book we are not writing. The boy who carried the door, now a man with a back that complains only in the morning and then forgives, sits on the bench the carpenter left in the wood. He puts his hand to the grain and hears nothing but feet and rain and the common creak of a city making sense of itself. He is content. "You are a good door," he says. "You are a better threshold." Even Wolf, who distrusts sentiment on principle because it is hard to tax, touches the wood on certain days with 2 fingers and then his lips, the way men apologize to places. He teaches his son to do the same, and his son rolls his eyes and does it, and the world survives both gestures. In a summer of figs, a last delegation from the city of fog arrives. They have shaved their word forever down to a delicate pin and wear it where their throats meet their collars. Hecuba is wind now. Her opinion moves leaves. Andromache receives them with a cloth over her shoulder and a child on her hip, who is not hers and is hers in all the ways that matter. She feeds them, as the hollow always has, and when they say haven, she smiles and says, "We have one." She points at the ground. They look and see only wood. Some learn, some do not. It is none of her business. The delegation leaves with extra bread. Fog curls and sulks. The island that smiles too much invests in clouds and loses interest in men. The river keeps telling secrets to ankles, and the ankles spend them wisely. On the day they finally carve a name in stone, modest, local, not yet a shout. The whole town walks the threshold first. To teach the stone its place in the grammar, the children go twice, because children are verbs. The household gods receive crumbs. The traveler's god dozes with soup smell in its hollow belly. The bench keeps its dent. The gate creaks in a key the carpenter taught it. Evening. Smoke rises in small opinions, exactly as Aeneas wanted. Ascanius has his pack on. Andromache has her knives where they belong. Cassandra counts to a number only she needs. Wolf checks the ridge and finds it faithful. Sinon sails by and does not come ashore. Menelaus somewhere feeds a horse. Helen somewhere lets her hair down and is unobserved. The boy, Man, who carried the door, stands last upon the wood. He thinks of reeds and laundry water and the first breeze that was not wind. He thinks of lists that turned back into roads, of girls who did not jump, of gods who learned crumbs. He lifts his heel and sets it down gently. The threshold creaks approval. He smiles. "End," he says to the door. And because it is horizontal now and understands books, it allows the word. Aeneas and his son step out into the road west. The town steps back into itself without collapsing. Somewhere beyond the bend, weather tries on a new name and decides against it. The river laughs where no one can hear. The island looks away. In the hush that follows, bread breaks, and the city eats, and after eating, sleeps. The threshold is crossed and crossed and crossed, and the story, faithful at last to the shape it has chosen, closes itself softly, the way a door does in a house that has finally learned how to be one.